This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether it's your new profession or just a lifelong passion, start your journey to website glory with Squarespace. Check out their amazing all-in-one platform through the link in the description below. More about them in a bit. Some 1,400 kilometers east of Moscow, near the Ural Mountains, sits a city that should be infamous. Yekaterinburg is today Russia's fourth largest city, a modern, attractive metropolis that wouldn't look out of place gracing the front cover of Fodor's magazine. But go back in time a mere 40-odd years to when the city was known as Sverdlovsk, and things were very different. It was here in the spring of 1979 that the USSR suffered its worst ever biological disaster, a catastrophe so great it's been called the biological Chernobyl. After an air filter broke at a secret bioweapons lab, a deadly cloud was accidentally released. Carried on the winds, it distributed its microscopic load over factories, parks, homes, falling like dust over places up to 50 kilometers away. Only it wasn't dust the cloud contained, but anthrax. Tiny aerosolized spores of one of the deadliest bacteria known to man. What followed would be a nightmare beyond all imagination. That spring, local hospitals were flooded, deaths racked up, the military moved in, desperate to contain the fallout. Yet even as Sverdlovsk descended into hell, the authorities were already preparing one of the greatest cover-ups in Soviet history. In the early 1970s, the world had a problem. By this point, humanity had gained the technological know-how to cause Armageddon countless times over, reducing civilization to so much radioactive dust by just flicking a switch. Luckily, while the dangers of nuclear weapons were extremely obvious, so were the forces stopping anyone from actually using them. Less obvious were the incentives against biological warfare, and that was an issue. In this era, you see, scientists have become absolute experts at concocting nightmares in little glass vials. In pristine laboratories, dedicated teams were weaponizing smallpox or creating strains of tularemia that could resist all kinds of antibiotics. In the US, researchers became so proficient at refining anthrax, it was estimated they could use the bacteria to kill everyone in a 1-kilometer radius for the bargain basement price of $1. With such awesome capacity for germ warfare, it was clear that the planet was becoming a biological accident just waiting to happen. That we might all wipe ourselves out with a weaponized plague before we manage to do it with nukes. Hence the Biological Weapons Convention. First ratified in 1972, the BWC pledged all signatories to abandon their bioweapons programs and basically just stop messing around with really terrifying shit. Among those who joined the convention were the US, the UK, and the USSR. Apparently, though, the Soviet delegate had kept his fingers crossed the entire time. Within 2 years of signing a piece of paper committing to doing the exact opposite, the USSR was establishing its Biopreparat Agency. Designed to mimic a civilian disease research facility, Biopreparat was, in reality, a sprawling network of labs dedicated to breeding germs capable of screwing the human body up in new and exciting ways. Across 40 sites, some 50,000 employees conducted experiments on things like bubonic plague and Legionnaire's disease, things that could cause chaos if released into a human population. And freakily, that human population was closer than you would imagine. While the USSR maintained a few remote bioweapon facilities like the notorious Aralsk 7, the BWC meant Western spy planes were now on the lookout for secret laboratories. So, the Soviets started sticking their new labs in the last place that anyone would look, slap bang in the middle of populated areas. The Kremlin gambled that the West's thought process would go something like this. Knowing the risks, no one would be crazy or stupid enough to place a bioweapons facility in the middle of a city. Therefore, these shiny new labs must be for civilian purposes. To which we can only imagine Leonid Brezhnev laughing in Soviet. Unbeknownst to the wider world, labs began popping up across populated districts. Labs working around the clock, producing the bioweapon equivalent of a neutron bomb. It was a crazy strategy, one which required an absolute iron commitment to safety. But this being the Soviet Union, safety was basically Russian for not giving a f***. In 1971, a bioweapons test near the city of Aral in Kazakhstan resulted in a smallpox outbreak. 10 people were sickened, 3 of whom died. But it would be in a city over 1,000 kilometers away that the worst accident of all took place. Known as Sverdlovsk, today Yekaterinburg, the city's outskirts were home to a laboratory known as Compound 19, and Compound 19 had one task: to produce weaponized anthrax on an industrial scale. In terms of scary things Mother Nature can throw at you, it's hard to think of anything scarier than Bacillus anthracis. The bacteria that causes anthrax, Bacillus anthracis, is found naturally in the soil, but that doesn't mean it's harmless. Not at all. Contract anthrax, and unless you get some powerful antibiotics ASAP, your chances of survival will range anything from unlikely to, well, dude, it's been nice knowing you. At the less worrying end of the scale is cutaneous infection caused by the bacteria getting through a cut on your skin. The result is usually a large coal-black welt and a 20% chance of death. Remarkably, this is about the best possible outcome. If bacteria instead gets in via your mouth, say by eating infected meat, then your chances of death leap as high as 60%. By way of comparison, smallpox has a fatality rate of about half of that. But the real nightmare comes if you inhale anthrax spores. What follows is the medical equivalent of Wile E. Coyote dropping an anvil on your chest. As the bacteria releases toxins, your lungs fill with fluid. Your oxygen levels drop until your skin turns blue. For all but 10% of victims, that's it. For 9 in 10 people who contract it, inhalation anthrax is the final stop on the scenic road that we call life. Thankfully, inhalation anthrax is extremely rare. The spores of Bacillus anthracis are ever so slightly too big to be easily breathed in, capable of getting stuck in human nostrils. Unfortunately for the residents of Sverdlovsk, Compound 19's entire deal was making sure that those spores could be ground up fine enough to enter any lungs. Now, it's important to note that a lot is still unknown about Compound 19. For example, some still contend that it was not working on bioweapons, but instead vaccines. However, high-profile defectors from the biopreparat program, such as former Colonel Ken Alabek, have painted a much darker picture. According to their recollections, the Sverdlovsk lab was basically an anthrax factory. Based on germ lab blueprints captured from the Japanese at the end of World War II, Compound 19 was reportedly filled with machines for drying spores and grinding them into an unbelievably fine powder. At such concentrations, a mere 100 kilograms of anthrax released into the air over a city can kill up to 3 million people, and Compound 19 was producing way more than just 100 kilos. One estimate we saw put the lab's production capacity at nearly 30 times that every single year. Even if that's a wild overestimate, it still signals that this was a serious facility. It was also one lacking the safety protocols that you'd expect of somewhere so dangerous. While employees were vaccinated against anthrax, the only thing standing between the lethal spores and the city of Sverdlovsk was a single set of air filters. If one of those air filters were to break, the results could be catastrophic. Sadly, in spring of 1979, break is exactly what one of those air filters was going to do. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a moment, but first, here's a word from today's video sponsor, Squarespace. Think about it, this is the age of creation. Everyone is out there on the internet, and they're making something. We don't just go to the internet to consume anymore, we go there to create. And if you've got a great idea for a website that you want to move from your head to the screen in front of you, well, that's where Squarespace comes in. It's the perfect web tool to help you fashion the internet into whatever you want it to be. Maybe you're the hands-on type, you've got lots of opinions about what your website should look like. Fantastic, don't worry, Squarespace is extremely customizable. Or maybe you're someone who is not so design-focused, not so able to make things look pretty. Well, don't worry, Squarespace also has tons of templates, so you can just select one, customize it, and boom. Easy. Beautiful website. Simply done. And once you're done setting up your website, locking in the name, maybe playing with some of the colors, there are tons of extra features that Squarespace provides so your website can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 customer support. Everything you could ever want is in one place. So when you're ready to get started on the next project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, you've got to do it with Squarespace. Right now, you can go to squarespace.com for a free trial. When you're ready to launch your new site, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And let's get back to it. When writing about the Sverdlovsk anthrax leak, people often compare it to Chernobyl, the infamous 1986 nuclear disaster that irradiated northern Ukraine. There are many similarities. Both resulted in a failed cover-up, both came close to being much, much worse, and both happened because of human failure. But while the failures that led to Chernobyl were long and technical, the screw-up that released a bioweapon into Sverdlovsk was both simple and depressingly stupid. At the end of a shift at Compound 19, a technician discovered one of the air filters leading to the outside world was clogged. No one knew for sure when this occurred. Some sources say March the 30th, 1979, others say March the 31st, or even April 2nd. What matters, though, is that the technician removed the clogged filter and then wrote a note for the guy overseeing the shift telling him that it needed to be replaced. Unfortunately, though, the guy either never saw the note or was more like, I'm on my break, I'm good. Either way, the missing filter was never recorded in the logbook, so when the next shift started, the new supervisor checked for any mechanical errors and finding none written down, he ordered the spore drying machines be switched back on. And so the pipe with the missing filter roared back into life, and as the hours passed, it began to expel an invisible cloud of microbes into the cool Russian air. Microbes that were picked up by the wind and scattered in a 50-kilometer line. Known as the wind zone, this line swept south, passing over a ceramics factory, over a park, over streets and homes. Undetectable to the naked eye, it was also incredibly narrow, the sort of corridor you could cross over in moments without ever noticing. But for anything alive in that corridor at that time, well, let's just say they probably weren't alive for very much longer. The first sign something was badly wrong came in early April. By now, the missing filter had been noticed and replaced, yet no one at Compound 19 had thought to report the accident further up the chain of command. It was only a minor mistake, one which they hoped had gone unnoticed. That hope finally collapsed on April 4th. That evening, the chief medical officer of Hospital 24, Margarita Ienko, received a panicked phone call from a doctor at another hospital. For a couple of days, patients had been coming in complaining of fevers, chest pain, and difficulty breathing. No one had been sure what to make of it, but now Ienko got perhaps the scariest news she had received in her professional life. The other hospital had just confirmed a diagnosis of anthrax in a worker named Nikolaev. Already, 2 patients were dead. In no time at all, that death count would skyrocket. The next day, 5 patients died at Ienko's hospital from the disease, and more people were arriving every hour, all displaying the horrifying symptoms of inhalation anthrax. People like 32-year-old Raisa Smirnova, a worker at the ceramics factory downwind of Compound 19. Smirnova was at her job one morning in April when a colleague asked why her hands were blue. Within hours, she and dozens of co-workers were racked with fevers, every breath they took as painful as a rubber bullet to the chest. The same afternoon, Smirnova was rushed unconscious to the hospital. By the time she woke up, 18 of her colleagues would have died. Come mid-May, there'd been at least 100 anthrax diagnoses in Sverdlovsk and some 66 deaths. Yet even as the city slipped toward chaos, the Soviet authorities had already made a fateful decision. Rather than concentrate on the disaster itself, they were going to use all of their energies to make sure no one found out what caused it. The scenes that greeted residents of Sverdlovsk that spring were of a scale and nightmarish intensity that wouldn't be seen again until the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. As hospitals filled with pneumonia patients, the city desperately scrambled to stop the steady drip of deaths from becoming a tsunami. Penicillin was handed out like candy, thrown at anyone with even the faintest flu-like symptoms. Teams armed with needles fanned out across the city administering anthrax vaccines. Up to 50,000 people were given either the shot or antibiotics, a sign of how far local authorities feared the microbes had spread. Meanwhile, the bodies of the dead were being soaked in agricultural disinfectant, hospitals scrubbed with chlorine. In streets where the spores were thought to have landed, all the stray animals were shot, and every house and road and tree were blasted with fire hoses. Unfortunately, some of the cleanup crews seem to have had no experience dealing with biohazards. In the Chakalovsky district, buildings were sprayed with water. Rather than kill the anthrax spores, this again kicked them high up into the air, causing a whole new wave of infections. This was the background against which Margarita Ienko was writing her secret diary on the outbreak, recording the emergency establishment of a new hospital, Hospital 40, to deal with the victims. Yet even amidst this growing emergency, the KGB was working overtime to establish a bulletproof cover-up. While the Chernobyl meltdown 7 years later would emit so much radiation that keeping it secret would be physically impossible, in Sverdlovsk, the KGB were helped by several factors. The fact was that the leak had been a one-time event. That meant that there was a finite amount of anthrax that had escaped, meaning an upper limit on how many it could kill. The second came thanks to the nature of anthrax itself. Unlike, say, influenza, anthrax doesn't spread from human to human. So while having 100 cases was 100 more than any city needs, it also wasn't just the beginning. No matter how many family members the infected coughed over, the case numbers wouldn't start rising exponentially. The third advantage the KGB enjoyed was dumb luck. When the spores leaked from Compound 19, the winds had been blowing away from the city centre towards less inhabited places. Had it been blowing in the opposite direction, the case numbers by mid-May wouldn't have peaked at 100, but at 100,000. And so, with their asses happily covered, the KGB got to work. In hospitals, doctors suddenly found themselves being led into backrooms and ordered to hand over all of their records. Bodies went missing from morgues, death certificates were altered so victims appeared to have died months apart. But the real genius lay in the cover story. Since it was certain that news of an anthrax outbreak in a major Russian city would escape, the KGB decided to roll with it. Rather than deny anything, they were all like, sure, there's anthrax here, but it's gastrointestinal. These guys didn't inhale a bioweapon, they just ate infected meat. For any doctor actually on the ground in Sverdlovsk, this was clearly nonsense. The effects of gastrointestinal and inhalation anthrax are utterly different. But any doctor actually in Sverdlovsk would have also been a doctor the KGB could easily have arrested. Meanwhile, experts on the other side of the Iron Curtain would be unable to verify if the infected meat story was true or not. Especially when the KGB was going all out on spinning their tail. That April and May, flyers were distributed over Sverdlovsk warning people against eating black market meat. Several butchers and unofficial vendors were arrested and charged with contaminating food. The regional health authority began seizing stocks of meat, running tests, and destroying it. It was a bizarre charade, a painful attempt to deflect attention from the truth. For 12 years, it would also work. Come summer, the situation in Sverdlovsk was back under control. The last confirmed anthrax death would be in mid-June. Meanwhile, the cover story was doing exactly what the KGB had dreamed of. In 1986, after years of studying the data, American expert Matthew Meselson would tell the CIA he thought the Soviet explanation was plausible. That same year, the Nobel Prize-winning molecular biologist Joshua Lederberg would take a trip to Moscow to examine reports on the outbreak and come back similarly convinced. In 1988, a team of Soviet scientists even gave a detailed talk at the National Academy of Sciences, where they showed autopsy photos and tissue slides that all seemed to point to infected meat being the culprit. It was almost as if, through sheer effort, the USSR believed it could will an alternative universe into existence, one in which there had never been a bioweapons facility in Sverdlovsk. But while it might be fashionable today to talk about there being no single objective truth, the trouble is that pesky things like evidence usually say otherwise. And despite the best efforts of the KGB, not all evidence of the leak had been destroyed. During the depths of the anthrax crisis, autopsies had been carried out by Faina Abramova and Lev Grinberg. After opening up her first anthrax victim, Abramova had approached Grinberg at a Sverdlovsk dance. There, under the cover of music, she had whispered an audacious plan in his ear, a plan to preserve proof of the outbreak's true nature. As the morgues flooded with corpses, they'd both taken lung tissue samples, preserving them in formaldehyde and hiding them among other jars of pickled organs at the Pathology Museum. It had been the sort of work that could have gotten them arrested. But they weren't the only ones. Over in Hospital 24, Margarita Yanko kept a secret diary recording symptoms and death counts. Informers, too, managed to sneak some information out. Before 1979 was even over, the first reports had appeared in the British press that the Sverdlovsk outbreak could be traced to a secret lab. Clear proof that the USSR had violated the BWC. Then there were the defectors. In 1989, leading biopreparate scientist Dr. Vladimir Peshenik defected to the UK, where he revealed the existence of the Soviet bioweapons program. Suddenly, the lab leak theory was back in the news. In the end, though, it would be global events that confirmed what everyone suspected. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 overturned notions of secrecy across all of its former republics. Even in Russia itself, the year zero effect of communism's implosion saw people who'd once swam liberally in a sea of lies start freely admitting the truth. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin confirmed to a reporter that the anthrax outbreak had been a result of a lab accident. But proof would go beyond just the word of one magnificently drunk politician. For a brief window in the early 1990s, the KGB files were open to Western researchers. A steady trickle of academics immediately headed east to uncover hidden truths of Soviet history. Most of them headed straight for Moscow, where the action was. But not all of them. Perhaps annoyed at being duped in 1986, Matthew Meselson and his wife Janine Gierman led a group of American scientists not to the Russian capital, but to Yekaterinburg, east of the Ural Mountains. There they would finally find hard scientific evidence of the worst biological accident in Soviet history. The fact the American team uncovered the truth was due to both diligent work and good fortune. Good fortune because when Faina Abramova and Lev Grinberg found out about the investigation, they retrieved their hidden samples and handed them over. Those samples clearly showed lymph node swelling in victims' chests, a sure sign of inhalation anthrax. And diligent work because the team made several inspired decisions during the investigation. The first came when they plotted those who'd been infected on a map and found them scattered all over the city. Rather than give up, though, they went and interviewed the families and found out where the victims had worked. That done, they replotted the map to show where they'd been during shift time. What came back was a map with a narrow band of infections on it, all stretching downwind from Compound 19 in a straight line for 50 kilometers. As Dr. Meselson rightly noted in his report, bad meat does not go in a straight line 50 kilometers long. Eventually, the team concluded that the lab's missing air filter, reported previously by defector Ken Allerbeck, had released a few milligrams of spores that had been carried by the wind. A few milligrams, probably not even enough to be visible to the naked eye, and yet it had caused so much damage, and so much suffering, and so much death. And it's here that we come to the great unknowns that still surround this case. Despite the fall of the Soviet Union, and despite Messelson's investigation and the accounts of defectors, it's still unknown exactly how many died in the Sverdlovsk anthrax leak. Messelson logged 77 infections, not all of whom died. Other estimates have put the number closer to 105 dead, with many thousands of infections potentially treated with penicillin. And that's just the more plausible totals. In her secret diary, Margarita Yenko recalled 45 dying in a single day at a hospital, alongside hearing rumors that over 200 had died during the same period at Hospital 40. While that's almost certainly a massive overcount, it does highlight the mysteries still surrounding the disaster. Mysteries that also include why only 2 of the dead were female, and why no one under the age of 24 was infected. As time goes by, these lingering questions are only going to become harder to solve. Today, the Kremlin has once again turned to denying a lab leak ever happened at Sverdlovsk. Only, instead of blaming infected meat, the new theory pinpoints a more convenient enemy, a Western agents who deliberately released anthrax spores to sabotage Russia. In our current age of disinformation, it seems like any lie can find an audience. The Sverdlovsk lab leak, then, may not quite have been in the same league as Chernobyl. Unlike the abandoned wastes around Pripyat, Yekaterinburg is still inhabited, even thriving. Yet it's worth remembering the similarities between the two. In both cases, authorities responded to a disaster not with openness, but with obfuscation, lies, and a half-assed cover-up. A cover-up that helped nobody but those in power, while leaving ordinary people exposed to incredible danger. This video may have been mostly the tale of a grim accident at some long-forgotten Soviet facility, but it should also act as a warning of what happens when those in charge care only about protecting themselves. We can only hope it's a warning that one day humanity will learn to heed.